Welcome back to the Program Design Series. In this installment, we're going to cover intensity and reps, how to prescribe them, and reasons they may need to be adjusted or prescribed differently for certain athletes. You can find the first 3 videos in the series linked in the description. It's impossible to discuss intensity or reps without the other because they're dependent on each other. The higher the intensity, the fewer reps are possible, and the higher the reps, the lower the possible intensity. The combination of the two also determines how effectively training is within physically possible ranges. For example, it's possible to squat 60% for triples, but that's not going to drive any strength adaptation or hypertrophy. We need either higher intensity or higher reps to accomplish those things. However, as I'll discuss soon, that doesn't mean a rep and intensity combination like that has no use. There's a popular idea known as minimal effective dose, which is the smallest amount of training that produces a positive adaptation, which is touted as being efficient, everyone's favorite word. This makes sense for reluctant exercisers with limited time and interest, but not for athletes chasing the best possible performance. What we're interested in is maximally effective dose, the amount of training that produces the greatest adaptation possible in the given circumstances. The mistake people make is thinking that your only 2 choices are minimal effective dose or a training program that's too hard and therefore doesn't work, which is nonsense. Depending on the circumstances and athlete, these 2 approaches might not actually be very different, but I think it's an important distinction to make so you know what you're actually trying to accomplish. All programs, regardless of the athlete and the goals, need to be built with the athlete's capabilities and the training and recovery circumstances in mind. So if a program is too much for an athlete to handle and therefore fails, the problem isn't that you were trying to make as much progress as possible. The problem is that you didn't do a good job writing the program. We're only interested in efficiency insofar as it allows us to accomplish the most with whatever time and resources we have available. We don't want just enough. We want it all. We can select rep numbers based on the purpose of an exercise at that time, or as a function of the desired intensity. Possible purposes are strength, power, speed, technique, hypertrophy, warm-up, and recovery. Of course, we're never really going to be only training one of those things at a time, but we'll be emphasizing one over the others based on the associated intensity, the exercise, and the manner of its execution, such as altered tempos, pauses, etc. Strength work is going to be in the 1 to 5 rep and 80 to 100% range, with a bias toward the 1 to 3 rep range. Speed and power are going to be in the 1 to 3 rep and 60 to 75% intensity range to maximize speed of execution and also maintain it as well as possible through a set by minimizing the accumulation of fatigue with excessive rep numbers. More speed emphasis will move the intensity lower, and more power emphasis will move the intensity higher within this range. Similarly, technique will be in the 1 to 3 rep and 50 to 70% intensity range to allow the feel and influence of a reasonable amount of resistance, but the ability to execute reps as precisely and consistently as possible with the correct rhythm and minimize physical and mental fatigue. Hypertrophy rep numbers can vary quite a bit in terms of what's effective based on the exercise and a given athlete's response, but typically we're looking at 5 or more reps in the 60 to 80% intensity range, but greater proximity to failure through higher rep numbers than we'd normally use at those intensities. Finally, true recovery work is going to generally be in the 2 to 3 rep and sub 60% intensity range to allow easy, accurate lift execution with absolutely minimal fatigue. This is lifting to keep the motor skills and mobility fresh while allowing the body to recover from whatever fatigue we've created with previous training. We can break these intensity ranges down more, although it's not generally necessary to get that detailed outside of academics. You're also going to see variations in these kinds of categories depending on the application, and even among athletes depending on things like neurological efficiency, so it's best not to use them as anything more than a really loose set of guidelines. Selecting rep numbers as a function of intensity means that we're working with the limitations of the weight. If we want 90% plus intensities to drive maximal strength or to get exposure to heavy Olympic lifts for competition prep, we're going to largely be stuck in the 1 to 3 rep range because that's simply what's physically possible, even if theoretically we wanted more reps for some reason. We'll generally push to the high end of the range for strength and more basic lifts like squats, and err more on the lower end of the range for technical lifts like the snatch, clean, and jerk to avoid unnecessary disruption of optimal technical execution as a product of fatigue. Bear in mind that what an athlete is capable of in terms of reps at any given percentage varies based on factors like training experience, the type of programming the athlete is conditioned for, gender and other genetic factors influencing neurological efficiency, as well as the type of lift. Generally, female athletes are capable of performing more reps at a given percentage than male athletes due to lower neurological efficiency, which makes the 1 rep max that percentages are based on less of a maximal effort with regard to absolute physical capacity. An athlete who has trained for years with high reps is of course going to be able to perform more reps at a given percentage than an athlete who has only trained in the 1 to 3 rep range for their whole career. Also remember that the more complex, technical, or speed dependent a lift is, the fewer reps are possible at a given intensity. For example, athletes will be capable of more reps in the back squat than in the snatch at 90%. A squat has no meaningful technique component and has no real demand on speed. A snatch, on the other hand, is highly technique and speed dependent. Fatigue from accumulated reps reduces speed and creates opportunity for reduced technical precision, increasing the likelihood of failure much more quickly than we would see in a squat. A more advanced and technically proficient athlete will be able to complete more reps of a technical lift than a less advanced, less proficient athlete because they'll maintain greater consistency and precision rep to rep, meaning not just less opportunity for missing due to imprecision, but less fatigue due to their lower energy use for corrective efforts. That also means less doubt in their ability to complete subsequent reps, meaning more confidence and commitment and a higher likelihood of succeeding. So we always have to take these kinds of things into consideration when prescribing the combination of reps and intensity, because the same prescription can be too easy for one athlete and too difficult for another, or appropriate for one exercise and not another one. This is one of many reasons it's so important to track your athlete's training data so that you have records to base future program choices on, rather than having to just rely on basic guidelines like Prelipin's table or other programming conventions. We can also consider prescribing a range of reps rather than a fixed number in certain cases. This is more appropriate for strength lifts and accessory work than Olympic lifts, but occasionally might be used for at least competition lift variations. If during a phase of training we want the athlete to be pushing to a certain effort level, and for whatever reason we can't ensure accurate rep and intensity combinations for a given exercise, we can provide a rep range that lets the athlete adjust to meet that effort intent. This can be to avoid harder sets than we want, or to let the athlete push harder if needed. Something I do pretty regularly, usually before a deload week, and usually only on the final set of a strength exercise, is give athletes bold rep numbers in the program. They know that if a rep number is bold, it means they can increase that number based on how they feel, but it's not intended to be a max effort, maybe around 8 to 9 RPE. I'll also sometimes give them a cap on the reps if needed so they don't get carried away and end up crippled with soreness the next day after doing 18 squats. This is a simple way to increase the stimulus without creating a bunch of extra fatigue, and it's also good data for adjusting prescriptions in the future if the athlete's performance consistently shows you that your prescribed reps at that intensity are way off from what you intend, as shown by a big disparity between the original numbers and their bold sets. So we understand that intensity and rep numbers are interdependent, and we have some good ranges for the combination to serve different purposes. Now we need to decide how to prescribe intensity. We have a number of options. We can prescribe absolute intensity by giving the lifter an actual weight in kilos, relative intensity with a percentage of 1 rep max, or we can use a few subjective methods. The first of those is simple descriptions like light, easy, or moderate. This can be appropriate for accessory work that doesn't really need quantified intensity, although it's definitely vague and not all athletes will do a good job choosing appropriate weights. Better are systems like RPE or RIR. These are still subjective, based on an athlete's self-evaluation of effort, but they're quantified in a sense so we can at least communicate the intention for effort more effectively. And then we have a max effort or nearly so type approach in which an athlete takes a set up to a rep max or close to it, and maybe then does some back off sets with the same or different rep numbers, the intensity of which can also be chosen subjectively, but is often prescribed as a percentage of that rep max. As I've said a number of times in this video series, prescribing actual weights for your athletes is typically the best approach. This is only possible when you have adequate experience with that athlete and a history of training to refer to. But it allows you to know exactly what they've done and been capable of in the past, meaning you can much more easily maintain a continual increase over time to ensure you're always following that most important principle of progressive overload rather than inadvertently going in circles. This is most useful and practical when you're reusing training cycles or when they're very similar to previous cycles, because what an athlete can and should do in a given exercise has to be considered in context. They're not doing only that lift. They're doing an entire program which will influence their capability at that time for the lift in question. Percentage prescriptions are the most common approach for good reason. They're objective, so there's no having to rely on an athlete to make good decisions, which is often a risky proposal, and they give us a decent representation of effort, so it's fairly easy to prescribe intensity for exercises or rep ranges an athlete hasn't done before. Percentages also usually conform well to a given athlete's typical effort. A percentage of a 1 rep max is basically a fraction of that athlete's hardest effort, meaning that whether they're the type of athlete who will risk death to complete a max single, or the type who look like they're still warming up during a max lift, percentages of that lift will reflect that same relative effort level. This means that we can adjust percentages a bit to address that if needed to effectively reduce or increase a lifter's effort level in their day-to-day training as we see fit. So with the athlete who's at death's door on every max lift, we can reduce the percentages we prescribe to keep them at a more effective effort level in training so they don't blow themselves out. And with athletes who tend to cruise a bit too much with max lifts, we can bump percentages up a bit to force them to put out more effort. Percentages will often also need to be adjusted for 2 other basic reasons. With strength work like squats, we need to consider neurological efficiency to some degree. This is basically how much of their true absolute strength potential an athlete can access voluntarily. As I mentioned earlier, due primarily to the influence of testosterone, female athletes will generally have lower neurological efficiency than males, meaning their 1 rep maxes are somewhat less of that absolute potential, and this in turn means they will be typically capable of doing more reps at a given percentage than male athletes of similar training history. So we may need to bump percentages up a bit in strength work to reflect this and get the effort level we're looking for. Newer lifters will be similar in that due to low neurological efficiency from a lack of training, low technical proficiency, and often not yet really having learned how to train well, their efforts less accurately reflect their basic physical ability. This means that even basic strength work may need to use higher percentages than more experienced athletes, but primarily this is going to affect things like pulling variations that are prescribed as a percent of the associated competition lift. Because their competition lifts are limited by technical ability rather than strength and power, typical pull loading is going to be too light to have much if any real effect. Pull and deadlift loading will need to be prescribed somewhat independently of the snatch and clean based on the assessment of the athlete's ability in those lifts themselves. But again, it's important to keep in mind that these are broad generalizations and that a lot of other factors like training history can influence this. So while you may expect certain things to be true, ultimately you always need to be prescribing based on the individual rather than a demographic. Finally, we have subjective intensity methods like RPE and RIR. RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. In other words, how hard the athlete feels they're working on a scale of 1 to 10. RIR stands for reps in reserve, meaning how many more reps in the set the athlete believes they could make with a true max effort. RPE is generally more suitable for Olympic weightlifting because we're normally dealing with low reps, so it's tough to be accurate with RIR because the scale doesn't leave much room. The trick with RPE is athletes learning how to self-evaluate accurately, which definitely takes experience. Something you can do as a coach is ask your athletes to write down what they think the RPE is on their top sets when prescribed in other ways to get them some practice and let you check how accurate you think they are. The primary benefit of these is that we can prescribe an intended level of effort without having to know all these details about a lifter that we need to use percentages as accurately as possible. In practice, RPE and RIR are arguably just as variable as percentages. The real difference is that we're shifting the choice of weight from the coach to the athlete. In other words, we're relying on the athlete to not only understand the intent of a given prescription, but also to be capable of accurately evaluating their level of effort, and this is notoriously problematic. You're going to get intensities that reflect a lifter's training tendencies, not just the desired effort level. Lifters who tend to not push as hard are going to overestimate their effort, which results in lower intensity. And lifters who tend to always push as hard as possible are going to underestimate their effort, which results in higher intensity. You'll get lifters failing partway through a set that's supposed to be 8 RPE. So while in theory it might be the optimal way to prescribe intensity for qualified athletes, there's a lot of potential for problems that need to be addressed as well as possible ahead of time. Newer lifters are good candidates for subjective intensity prescriptions because they don't have accurate 1 rep maxes to base percentages on in addition to the complications I talked about earlier. The problem is that they also don't have a well-developed ability to evaluate their own effort levels, if for no other reason than a lack of experience. So it's definitely a bit of a conundrum to wrestle with as a coach. You're left to decide what the most effective approach is for each athlete, and then do your best to educate them on what you're trying to accomplish so they're better able to contribute instead of derailing their own training with bad decisions. Ultimately, when using RPE or RIR, the coach needs to pay attention to how accurate the athlete's efforts appear to be relative to prescriptions, and then guide the athlete as needed to improve that accuracy. Like reps, we can also prescribe intensity ranges when appropriate, and for the same reasons. This is another time I give my athletes bold numbers, but in this case they're allowed to increase the weight of the bold sets rather than the reps when and if they're feeling good. This is a good way to ensure a solid baseline for a workout without holding an athlete back if they're having a good day. I'll most often do this on a heavy total day. I'll give the athlete the number of singles I want for each lift with the minimum weight I expect, and then make most of those top sets bold so they're able to push one or both lifts if they're feeling ready. And finally, remember that we can have a mix of different intensity prescription methods in a program. We don't have to use the same one for every exercise or phase of the cycle. We should always be trying to use what will be most effective at any given time for a specific exercise, purpose, and athlete. Next time, I'll get into volume and how to choose actual weights for a microcycle. Probably, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, depending on time. We are all just flying by the seat of my pants on this one. Please hit that like button and subscribe so that I'm not just sitting here screaming into the void.